and a sexual assault nurse examiner statewide program. Like I said, there's 16 staff, and we're managing 20 grants now, 7 of which are passed through to our members. I also oversee 2 statewide databases, a victim services database and an education and outreach database. The coalition has one other fiscal person who is almost full-time, and she also works with these databases. And when I say statewide, the databases are used by all of our member programs for reporting to funders, including the coalition. I also oversee the Office Information Technology, our facilities here in Concord, New Hampshire, and share human resources responsibilities with our Executive Director, Lynn Chalette. I supervise 2 staff, our office coordinator and our bookkeeper and bookkeeper data specialist. So most of what we're going to talk about today is related to federal funding. We're going to spend a good amount of time on specific resources, a few procedures, some policies that you could use once implemented will help sustain your coalition. As Lindsay said, I hope you'll feel comfortable to ask questions as we go along by typing in the chat box. And I will pause after each section to answer any questions that you've posted there. Wanted to mention that the goal today is to present to coalition board members, but if you're an executive director and you're listening in, I'll try to address that as well. There was a previous webinar recorded 2 weeks ago that was specifically targeted towards coalition staff, finance staff, and executive directors, which may be helpful to you if you weren't able to attend to listen in to. And also just one caveat, if you will, when I say coalitions or if I say agency, I also mean territories, not meaning to exclude you all. So today we're just going to have a broad base for the board gaining knowledge of its fiduciary responsibilities. We'll also discuss a 30,000-foot view, if you will, of what the board should know regarding financial management. We'll include some information on internal controls, what they are and what their purpose is. We'll discuss some best budgeting practices, and we'll also include financial reporting and what you can look for there as a board member. And finally, we'll discuss what the difference between an audit and a financial review is, and some specifics you can look for language in an audit. So we're going to give you a lot of information today. Some of it you may be quite familiar with already, and some hopefully is helpful and new. If you feel yourself getting overwhelmed, take a deep breath. I do often. It takes me, and it has taken many organizations time to build or revise their financial systems and for the board to gain expertise. So if you're able to say to yourself, well, I'll start or plan one new item from what I learned today this week or next week, well, it's really going to be a success for your organization. Also, I'm a finance manager, and I understand you might not be. So if I can explain or define terms, items, just please let me know. Finance is usually a concrete topic, and we're going to give you some best practices, but not all best practices are practical for every coalition. So I think most people understand that the board should understand the finances of the nonprofit and to ensure that the annual budget is responsible and that also proper financial controls are in place. Board members aren't supposed to manage day-to-day activities of the coalition, but will act as stewards of the coalition. And in practice, this means board members will be well informed, they'll hold regular board and committee meetings, and maintain accurate minutes of those meetings. Board members will encourage open discussion and basically pursue the charity's, well, not charity, the coalition's mission and best interests. So I did provide a handout that was titled, I believe, What are the Legal Responsibilities and Fiduciary Duties of Nonprofit Boards and Their Members? And there is specifically 3 duties that we're going to talk about, which are the duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. So directors and officers of your coalition are considered fiduciaries, or otherwise known as persons of trust. They have the power and the obligation to act with total trust, good faith, and honesty on behalf of the coalition. So leaders of nonprofits generally, as I said, have these 3 duties. So the duty of care, that includes obligations for you to keep informed as a board member, remain attentive, act in a manner that as a director, you reasonably believe in the best interest of the organization, and typically that will mean decisions that are made with requisite care. So in satisfying your duty of care as a board member, you should inform yourself of all the material information reasonably available to you. Implement a decision-making process that allows all members to carefully consider information and all reasonable alternatives. Seek advice from relevant industry, legal, or financial advisors, and maintain complete records of your board deliberations. The board would want to rely reasonably on the advice of outside advisors in discharging their, quote, duty of care, but they should not be passive recipients of that advice, but rather play a role in the information gathering and also in the decision-making process. So in reference to the duty of loyalty, unlike the duty of care, which largely concerns itself as a board's deliberative process, the duty of loyalty focuses on the substance of the board deliberations. So that is going to include a board director or officer's motives, purposes, and goals. The duty of loyalty requires each director to act in good faith and in a manner that the individual reasonably believes to be in the best interest of the organization. So directors and officers must take steps to not utilize coalition property or seize coalition opportunities for their own personal benefit or for the benefit of friends and families. And we're going to talk about that briefly regarding a conflict of interest statement. So as a result, in practice, the duty of loyalty's most common issues might be insider self-dealing or self-interest transactions. And to keep in mind that as a leader of the coalition, you could be personally liable if someone is acting based on their own self-interest in a way that doesn't serve the organization's interest. And the last one is the duty of obedience. And unlike the fiduciaries of for-profit companies, the directors and officers of the coalition must adhere to the third fiduciary duty of obedience, which requires them to carry out the purpose and the mission of the organization. And that's as expressed in the governing legal documents. So specifically, a board wants to engage in receiving and in reviewing timely and complete financial reports, establishing policies and procedures regarding fiscal matters, otherwise known commonly as internal controls, asking questions of leadership and senior finance staff on a variety of issues, not just financial ones. One thing that we're going to talk about throughout today is that the best practice is to establish a finance committee. I realize some coalitions might be very small, and perhaps a finance committee would just be the treasurer of the board and one or two coalition staff. But ideally, the treasurer of the board would chair the committee, and the board would receive minutes of the finance committee's activities on a regular basis. This chart gives a few practices that staff are responsible for and that boards are responsible for. I mentioned before that boards need to be careful not to micromanage or get into the specifics of the daily operations of the organization. There are exceptions to this. If there is a vacancy in senior leadership, your executive director or maybe senior finance staff or other key staff, a board member may need to help providing supervision or decision making when there are those vacancies. Just a common staff responsibility is to support the board so that the board can perform and fulfill the duties that we just discussed. So for instance, as I said, participating in the finance committee and reviewing financial statements are real key responsibilities of the board. So I know this was pretty fast, but actually this is the end of our section 1, and just want to pause, Lindsay, to see if we have any questions.
Doesn't look like we have any questions, Pam, and your audio on your voice is really great, so keep that up as well.
Oh, thank you. We did have a little trouble with our audio in the previous webinar, so I appreciate hearing that.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about high level, what I mean is that 30,000-foot view, not necessarily, the intellect. So board officers in particular would benefit from knowing in their particular state what agency has authority over charitable organizations. So here in New Hampshire, it's our Department of Justice. Sometimes it's the Secretary of State or Department of Revenue. It's important, I think, for board members to know that staff is aware of the filings and the annual reporting that needs to be made in reference to your state. There is a handout that is entitled Know Your Nonprofit Strengths and Weaknesses. And the reason I'm mentioning that here is that in reviewing your agency's financial condition, this tool can help guide strategic discussions on the financial future of the organization so that it could be helpful in a strategic plan type setting. This is just one tool that's designed to help you provide a data-driven assessment over your organization's financial health. Certainly any exercise that your coalition has done recently or wants to use that's going to result in a show of the agency's strengths and weaknesses is going to help you in preparing, for instance, your annual budget, and it's really going to provide the board with a snapshot of the organization's financial condition. And the other thing that boards, I believe all boards should really have available to them is a fiscal manual, and to be mindful that it needs to be updated when major changes occur, such as maybe a staff restructuring or a new accounting system, new banking, investment changes, and the like. It's important for board members to know where the agency legal documents are. In some cases, that's become part of a board manual. I've mentioned the Finance Committee and want to mention yet another handout that I provided, which is our coalition's Finance Committee schedule. And what it does is not only show when our Finance Committee is going to meet, but when we would present to our board certain statements throughout the year. And it's just an example, but we found that it really helps the Finance Committee understand, if you will, the flow of our finances, and also when and what is meaningful for the board members to review and at what time. So the Finance Committee is going to deal in the details of the finances of the coalition, and rather than the full board having to take on all those specifics, it would be the Finance Committee that would maintain or create the fiscal manual, and also making sure that the Finance Committee would provide the board with regular notes of minutes of their meetings. And the conflict of interest policy or statement that many boards should have these days, there is an example in our fiscal manual of the conflict of interest policy. I believe there is also, I was thinking that there was another handout on that, but there isn't. But essentially, the one thing to remember about having your conflict of interest policy is that every new board member should review the policy, understand it, and sign off on it. And that should be done annually for all board members, and it isn't just a one-time thing. We also have staff do a conflict of interest statement upon their employee, and staff also does those annually as well. So I wanted to mention internal controls, and before we get into that even further, I wanted to say that some of the documents that I have provided to you through the handouts have not been updated to reflect changes that the federal government has made regarding their Code of Federal Regulations. I know this is going to get kind of, what can I say, federal speak, and I apologize for that, but the Code of Federal Regulations are also known as, or used to be known as circulars, A133, A122, and whatnot. And those are, how the federal government describes to different organizations how they should be conducting themselves financially. But those have changed, and they have been combined and revised to now it's known as the Uniform Guidance. So all of those circulars have been combined. So our documents haven't been updated to reflect some of those changes. So you'll see throughout some of the documents in our fiscal manual the audit referred to as an A-133. It's not referred to that anymore by the federal government. It's really known as a single audit. And also our fiscal manual needs to be updated because some of our processes have changed, such as we have a per diem travel policy, electronic funds transfers and whatnot. When we update our funds fiscal manual, we'll be happy to make it available to anybody who may find it helpful. So essentially, internal controls are written processes, policies, and procedures of good financial management. The general rule is no one person should have control of all aspects of the financial transactions of the organization. And another common term is a segregation of duties. And again, no one person would have control over all aspects. So that's more difficult if you're a small nonprofit. Again, the internal controls will be detailed in your agency's fiscal manual. They, in fact, could be the fiscal manual. Essentially, it's the act of writing down and following good practice. I did have a handout which was an excerpt from our fiscal manual that we provide to our auditors and other folks who want a very small example of the types of internal controls that we here at the New Hampshire Coalition practice. So that's there for you. It would be the role of staff or management to design the policies and procedures and the board of directors, and it would be staff's role to implement those, carry out those consistently with the written policies and procedures, and it would be the role of the board to approve and monitor the internal controls on a regular basis. And that's one of the things that an auditor is going to do. They're going to check your financial processes to see if they're consistent with your written policy and procedure document, aka your internal controls. So a couple of very specific examples commonly practiced is that someone other than your bookkeeper or finance manager would approve expenses, would actually either be the person that would be providing and implementing and practice, I can't even speak now, writing out the checks, but they wouldn't necessarily be approving those expenses. Some agencies might limit the amount that a particular check is written for. That doesn't work for us at the Coalition because we are a pass-through. As I said, and I don't know, maybe I didn't, we pass through about $3 million to our member programs, and so on any particular quarter's reimbursement, we might have a pass-through check that would be almost $60,000 to a member program. So that doesn't work for us, but that can work quite well for other organizations. Another common internal control would be that the executive director would not approve their costs and write the checks. It would be one or the other, and more likely that they would approve the costs. We also see that there's often two signers to a check over a certain amount. There may be a board review as an option. And we absolutely know that it's best practice for any of the executive director's expenses and timesheets to be approved by a board officer. So other things that board members should know about is that when your organization is managing federal funds, there are a ton of regulations and laws that they need to comply with. So everyone probably receives a Office of Violence Against Women coalition grant, and many of the domestic violence coalitions on the call perhaps would receive a Family Violence Prevention Services Act coalition grant, and they have a long list of administrative and national policy requirements that coalitions must adhere to, and this slide actually is listing some of them. This slide is really an excerpt from one of the most recent VAWA coalition grant solicitations. And there was a more detailed description of these federal grant requirements in the previous webinar that we recorded for senior finance staff. And I don't think it's particularly pertinent to board members, but we just did want the board members to know that when you're managing federal funds, there's a lot to keep in mind and adhere to. And staff will know how to do that by reading every word, yes, I did say that, of the grant application, and when the grant award comes, the terms of those. Also, it's helpful for finance staff to delve into the uniform guidance to help determine some of the accounting systems that need to be followed and the allowable costs, cost allocation methods, and the like. One of the things that board members could have available to them, maybe there'd be a secure place on your website that board members would have password access to, or at least know how to receive, which is your Dun and Bradstreet number and your tax ID number. I just recommend that any board member would know how to access that quickly should they need it, or there would be an inquiry. There have been a lot of good resources for nonprofits that have been available the last 10 years or so. Prior to that, it was difficult. You had to buy services from an accountant or nonprofit consultants, few and far between. But now there's websites listed at the end of this where you can get policies and forms and whatnot. The National Network to End Domestic Violence and the Resource Sharing Project are regularly providing webinars like these, so I encourage folks to look towards those free, if you will, resources rather than trying to have to pay for them. But as I mentioned before, the fiscal manual is going to be an excellent place for a board member to understand what the staff is doing in regards to the finances. Contents of the fiscal manual can describe how the business of the coalition is being conducted, how payroll is handled, deposits, what software, accounting software is being used, what investment policies are, or reserve policies. So it's really quite a good tool. Another tool is any narrative that may be available to the board members of what's happened financially over the past, previous, and or current fiscal year. The agency budgets often will have narratives, and to look at those as often as you can. And the IRS 990 form and the annual, as I said, single audit, used to be called A133, all of those are going to provide a good picture of your nonprofits, of your coalition's fiscal health and your financial management strategies. So the 990 is used by tax-exempt organizations and to provide the IRS with financial data on your coalition. And it's 990 is available for public inspection, and it's how the public perceives how the coalition it's how they receive information on the coalition. So it's really advisable to make sure that the 990 is accurate and it fully describes the coalition's programs and your accomplishments. The 990 will tell any interested party in a more basic line-by-line fashion, rather than the audited statements, what the agency's bottom line is. In 2009, the form was revised to be more informative of the fiscal governance integrity of a coalition, and it asks questions such as, does your agency have a whistleblower policy? Are there any conflicting relationships? Does the coalition document meeting minutes? Were there any changes to the coalition's bylaws? And how does the coalition determine its top management compensation? So again, it's really key to ensure that that public document states what you want it to regarding the coalition. So again, I'm done with this particular section and will offer up any questions if there are any.
Press *6 to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question verbally. We don't have any questions in the chat box.
Okay, I'll just go ahead, and if somebody *6s and we hear them, we'll pause.
Great.
So in talking about budgeting, again, you may want to use that handout, the Nonprofit Financial Strengths and Weaknesses. There's a good checklist that, as I said, the results might help out. There's also another handout called the 10-Step Annual Budgeting Checklist that I think is going to be more helpful towards your staff, but the board could again review it and ask if certain items were done, or if if the finance committee or staff might have used some of those methods to help prepare the annual budget. We think that best practice is that it should be prepared and presented to the board at least 3 months prior to the end of the fiscal year. we here at the Coalition started our prep for our fiscal year that ends in next week, June 30th. We started our prep in February, and we presented our first draft to the board in March. And in working with your senior finance staff, the board treasurer specifically, and the finance committee, you all become experts about this budget. So it really helps to understand every line of the budget when it's being presented to you, where the money's coming from, what it's for, when it comes in. If it's a federal fiscal year grant, if it's a calendar year grant, those kinds of questions I think are helpful for finance committees to learn. You would hopefully be presented by staff with a narrative of the highlights of the past fiscal year, and they would use those narratives and the budget reports and whatnot to forecast towards the end of the year based upon how spending has been going. And a written assumption would be, say for instance, you might have a 3-year grant and the upcoming fiscal year would be in the 3rd year. So what would the revenue amount be brought into that 3rd year? Maybe there's a state unemployment tax rate that's changed significantly based upon claims made. You might want to, hopefully there'll be narratives on those types of items that boards can ask questions about and that staff is highlighting. And we think that best practice for staff to not only create the annual budget, but then they'll create in their accounting software monthly budgets so that it helps to create with cash flow forecasting and makes monthly budget reporting more accurate for the Finance Committee and ultimately for the board on a quarterly basis if that's when the board is looking at statements. The Finance Committee should really review all the budget drafts. I think that an active Finance Committee of a board has a unique perspective over staff. They offer up questions, I find, that really assist with some of the budget challenges that we have. And we all have those. So there is also another handout, which is the grant budget breakdown, and it's real specific on what to include in a specific grant. So it might not be as helpful for board members, but again, it just might have 1 or 2 things in there that would help you pose some questions when you're looking at a proposed budget. In reviewing the total agency budget, all revenues, expenses from all projected grants should be included in that. And there may be questions that you can ask in reference to a strategic plan process that you might have done recently, that if there's something in the budget that's reflective of that, you would want to know, and always good to ask questions about what changes might be forecasted for personnel, because that's almost always an agency's largest part of their budget. Let's see. So one of the things that the federal government and other larger organizations have recognized that is that nonprofits are really not able to cover all their costs with often the grants that they receive, and they need to do fundraising, they need to plan for the future, and so it is now actually acceptable for nonprofits to have an operating surplus, which is difficult, I think, for state coalitions, often more so than for, say, a local member program who's, I think, a little more nimble in many cases to be able to fundraise. But nevertheless, we provided a operating reserve toolkit for you. Often grants, you have to be careful because there are many grants, and certainly the coalition grants from FIPSA and from VAWA really aren't going to allow you to budget for reserves. So you'd be looking for state foundations, maybe some corporate grants, and we're seeing more often now that those types of entities are actually offering operating grants or limited time grants to help build up reserves or to help with fundraising. So that's something that if you've got staff that can spend a little time doing that, or a board member, it would be very helpful to your organization. So interesting for us, Grace Mattern, who was our executive director of 30 years, left in 2011. At the same time in the year, we decided to create a reserve policy for both our operating reserves and our capital reserve. and we embarked for the first time on a statewide fundraising plan. So needless to say, the board had their hands full with just trying to replace the executive director and not be fundraising for the reserve policy. So for our operating reserve, we had a goal to be at 6 months of operating cash within 7 years of when we started this in 2011. But we weren't able to do that. We're not able to accomplish that. Hopefully we'll be able to accomplish it within 10 years of the beginning of the reserve in 2011. Something we get asked about a fair amount is how are we paying for our organizational development type expenses? You know, board and staff, maybe your member communication type meetings, board development trainings or movement work, anti-oppression work, anti-racism, governance training, financial trainings. And most often we find that the FIPSA Coalition grant and the VAWA Coalition grants will pay for those types of activities. Not all grants will pay for those, so you want to make sure that you would access unrestricted funds for certain expenses. More often than not, food is problematic to get paid for out of the VAWA and the FIPSA Coalition grants. We find it's just easier to use unrestricted money for that. You can get a waiver and approval to do that with the 2 coalition grants, but as I said, we think it's just a little easier to pay for food expenses for those types of meetings, not through those grants. You may have some leadership transition expenses, such as a search consultant or moving expenses for a new ED, or as I said, board communication type meetings around search. Those will all be allowable. One of the things that we pay for in our budget, and we annually budget, is we have 4 representatives from our member programs that are part of our board composition. Our board composition is a minimum of 12 members and a maximum of 18. So we actually will reimburse them for their time attending board meetings or committee meetings of the board. We also reimburse them for their travel. And another large item of our budget for the coalition is to reimburse travel. Because we're such a small state, it works out pretty good that we have trainings for our member programs on a quarterly basis, and so we're able to have that be one of our large items in our budget. So after you've got the budget, you've got to be able to monitor it, and so there are statements that any board can choose to receive depending upon the complexity of the coalition's budget. The board may only want to see quarterly or even semi-annual statements, but in any event, they should be trained on how to read a balance sheet and a statement of activities and a statement of cash flow. We find at our coalition that a statement of cash flow is not as useful of a statement to our board because we have mostly federal and state grants, and our reimbursements we receive on a regular basis, so our cash flow does not fluctuate that much. I provided a handout, which is financial questions every board member could ask, and we have found that our board really likes this concrete way of asking questions from me, usually at a board meeting, and me answering it so that they can understand, why is this particular line item increased so much, or why haven't you been able to draw down as much of this grant that we would anticipate. So those are available for you. The Finance Committee, as I think I mentioned before, should see the balance sheet and at least a budget report on a regular basis. I would say even on a monthly basis. And that the dashboard, which we're going to talk about, or a dashboard, is more specifically helpful to a board member. And we're just going to talk about these statements just a tiny bit in detail. So the Statement of Financial Position, otherwise known as a balance sheet, is a big picture statement showing the coalition's financial position from any point in time. And it classifies items, revenue and expenses, into assets, liabilities, and net assets. So it's again, a more it's a good statement for an accountant to use, and accountants do use it. but it's not necessarily, I would say, board friendly. So you probably want to have a little training on how to read those. But these questions that we provided, as I said, should be helpful to answer things such as, well, is the coalition going to be able to pay its bills? What is the coalition's largest liabilities? Those two bullet items, those questions in particular, would be more of a narrative that you would be expecting from your senior finance staff or in writing. So the statement of activities, or statement of activities, it's a more detailed report with specific revenue and expense lines, whereas the balance sheet was consolidating those revenue and expense lines. So I think it's helpful to see more specifically, like, how is there a change in expenses related to the change, if there has been one, in revenue? What individual expenses have changed significantly? And again, that questions handout that I gave you hopefully will be helpful if you are reviewing a statement of activities. The one statement that, as I said, our Finance Committee receives and our board is a budget report. And a budget report is constructed similar to a statement of activities, the difference being that the statement of activities generally won't show a percent increase or decrease in a particular line item. Ours we're going to show you in a moment in detail. And then another way that you can show, the board can look at rather, revenue and expenses is via a ratio. So we don't do it that way here, but a lot of people do. So a ratio might be, what is the coalition's reliance on a source of income? So for instance, you would do the type of income divided by total income. Another ratio might be fundraising as a percent of your total budget. So that would be your fundraising income divided by your total income. Another common ratio would be your benefit expense rate. You know, benefits are driven by external factors, often, you know, increase at a different rate than other costs, so you might have a ratio for that. So I did have the handout of our monthly budget report, and it would be a whole lot easier for you to review than this slide. It's just a little, I would say it's too small. But I wanted to mention in terms of revenue that we actually show our board revenue by specific grant type. But many organizations will consolidate that, and it's perfectly fine to do so, that you would see revenue by, say, federal grants or state grants. Another line would be donations or fundraising. Another line would be fees. Another one, foundation. Another one, corporate, and then another, other. So I just wanted to mention that in reference to the way we do it. It's just one way. The other way is very common. And just in terms of being able to understand this particular report, it's as of a month's end, and we show in, as I said, the first column is the description of the revenue type, and then what our total budget is for the year, and then that third column is what we've actually received to date. So our example here is in March. What have we received? So it should be 9 months for March, or 75% of what we're expecting to either receive in revenue or to expense out. And that's because our fiscal year, as I said, is June 30th. And then the other two columns are showing you what we are over or under the budget by money and by percent. We find that for Finance Committee members that aren't fiscally trained, or any board members, this report can be very helpful to generate discussion, because lots of folks just go to the bottom line. Well, why is this 41% rather than 75% in terms of the revenue to be received? So that's a report we commonly use and our board likes. So I want to talk about dashboards. Dashboards are used instead of the very detailed statement of financial position, a very detailed budget report, statement of activities, and whatnot. It's the components of a dashboard are like a car's dials, if you will. I've heard oftentimes people say, well, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and that's really what a dashboard is about. It's usually charts or more picture-like rather than, accountese type language. So there's pros to a dashboard, and they're a good overview of the agency's finances in layman's language. It's one place to see progress rather than the multiple statements that we just talked about. It can be used to educate and empower staff to understand and board members to understand better the finances. Some cons of it are that reliance on a dashboard doesn't give the board an ability to understand the audited financial statements and to be completely fiscally responsible. Another con is once you've created a dashboard and the board is reviewing it, you have to be careful that when there would be something to revise, it's not left out and that it needs to be put in there in order to be able to be monitored. So dashboards usually include performance indicators or targets, and then you'll have trends. And so it's important to think about what the coalition would want in a dashboard, because it's like mapping out the requirements of a database or creating certain specific pieces of a program. Got to think about what you're doing ahead of time before implementing it. So there are things to consider. You want to make sure that your finance committee and senior finance staff, board treasurer consider many factors on what should be included and what really does the board need to know is going to be on that dashboard. You want to also determine the times or the time frames to use the dashboard. It doesn't need to take a long time to create a dashboard components, but as I said, thought and deliberations really need to go into what's required. So before I really delve into a little bit more about what the financial dashboard that our coalition is using, I wanted to thank Steve Zimmerman from Spectrum Nonprofit Services for the example, which is ours is modeled from. He's a CPA that's worked with NNEDV and the resource sharing projects throughout the years, and if you have particular financial issues that the coalition is facing, he would be happy to hear from you. And I did provide our financial dashboard as a handout to you. Again, it would be a whole lot easier to look at that probably than the slide. It's a little difficult. But we said, what really does our board want to know? So we have all of this information that's on the dashboard either in our budget report or our statement of financial position, but what does the board really need to know? Well, we find a very common indicator for any organization, whether it's a nonprofit or not, is how many days of cash do you have in hand? So we created a range of what would be optimum. Optimum would be 60 days of cash on hand. For us, we figured out that would be $105,000. And then we have trends showing that 9 months ago we were really doing great with $371,000. But that gives you an idea of one way to measure that. We have our operating our capital reserves here, and as you can see, we've got some work to do. But we also find that for us, for the coalition, it's really our unrestricted cash, which is no grant monies at all, no VAWA Coalition money, no FIPSA Coalition money. The days of cash on hand up above is all grant funds, including funds that we would be passing through our member programs, whereas the unrestricted cash figure in the fourth row down, I believe it is, as I said, what we've got to rely on, just no grant restricted funds, just our fundraising. And we were fortunate enough to have, if anybody knew what the Purple Purse was, but we were able to be in the top 10 nationally for that, so we did really well. So that's why we're at 647% of our goal for our unrestricted. And then the chart at the bottom of the dashboard is specifically derived from our budget report, the report that we just talked about. It shows that the bottom line is that we're in the black and we're receiving enough revenue to pay our expenses. There are other examples of dashboards that you can find on the internet. I can help if a board member is interested in, as I said, perhaps doing some ratios and showing those in a graph type fashion. But this is what we're using. So this is our end of that section on budgeting and financial reporting. Are there any questions, Lindsay?
Doesn't look like we have any in the chat. So again, if anyone wants to press *6 to unmute themselves. feel free to do so at this time.
Okay. So we're ending up on an extremely exciting section, which is about audits and financial reviews. It's best practice for organizations that handle a fair amount of money, and I'm sure almost all coalitions handle more than $25,000. I know you do because of those great coalition grants that we all receive. But when you're managing federal funds, it's really important that a board has an outside entity, usually a certified public accountant, to review their fiscal processes and their books. So there are differences between an audit and a financial review, and typically it's an audit that's going to cost more money. So right now, the uniform guidance that I had mentioned earlier actually raised the threshold of the amount of revenue that any nonprofit would be receiving to $750,000 in a fiscal year if your coalition is receiving more than $750,000 not receiving it. If your coalition is expending more than $750,000 in federal funds, you're going to need to have that single audit. What's interesting, if people have heard about the uniform guidance and how that's changing what the rules are that an auditor would use to audit an organization such as a coalition, the uniform guidance is effective as of December 2014. But if your fiscal year is ending June 30th, your fiscal year ended June 30th, 2014, the auditor is still going to follow those old rules. And even in June 30th for 2015 coming up, they're going to follow those old rules. And it isn't until June 30th, 2016 that auditors will start to follow the uniform guidance. If your staff or even the board would like more information on the uniform guidance and how that affects the coalition, there was a webinar previously recorded and conducted, sponsored by NNEDV and the Resource Sharing Project that I would direct you to for some more specific information on audits. So the other thing for boards to keep in mind is while we gave you a threshold here that was for federal expenses, your state may have a different requirement. And for instance, in New Hampshire, our requirement is $500,000. So we actually have to file statements with the state's Attorney General's office if we have revenues and expenditures of over $500,000. So essentially, a financial review is when an accountant reviews financial statements such as the balance sheet, the statement of cash flows, certain ledgers. They will then write up a statement upon what they find in their review of those financial statements. Whereas an audit differs because the auditor is going to delve more in detail in your books, in your accounting systems, in your practices and internal controls, and they're going to provide an opinion on those financial systems that, as I said, is going to be following those rules of the single audit that we find in the uniform guidance. It's much more extensive, and there's two phases to this single audit. The first phase is a planning phase where the auditor asks for documents from your staff such as a check register, general ledgers, payroll ledgers, copies of contracts and grants awards, etc. This can usually be provided all via email. This helps the auditor to determine what they're going to sample, is a term, during when they come to the on-site visit, otherwise known as the field portion of an audit. In the on-site portion of the audit, the auditor is going to ask for those documents that they said they wanted to sample. It's usually going to be timesheets, account payables with those approvals stamped on them, or if you keep them electronically, however that's done. They're going to ask for reports to be generated on the spot. I wouldn't be surprised if your staff might be asked to produce something via their computer while the auditors actually watch. But essentially they're going to then, well, let me back up. the one thing I wanted to tell everyone is that you, the coalition, and their board, you're hiring this auditor, and they are essentially working for the coalition. They have to check for certain specific activities and processes to be conducted according to generally accepted accounting principles, but they needn't overburden the staff to do so. So I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that we manage 20 contracts at least, and multiples of those federal and state contracts are subcontracted through to our member programs. But we find that our auditor is not on site in the field portion no more than 2 days. They'll draft up the statements that will be emailed to us, and that usually happens within 3 weeks from the time that they provided that field portion of their audit. They ask for us to provide feedback on the statements. We often will find some corrections that need to be made. They may ask us some questions, but this doesn't drag on with them asking questions and questions of our staff. If that happens, if you as a board member hear that that's happening, I think one of two things is occurring, and that's one, there could be problems with your books or maybe internal controls or something, or often might be the case is the auditor doesn't really understand their role. So staff should feel free to inquire if the audit is dragging on. Maybe a board member can help. But once the audit is considered final, it'll be presented to the board. I think more often than not will be presented to the board via the auditor himself or herself. And we find that that's best practice. It helps the board, I think, feel assured that what staff is telling them is backed up by what the auditor is saying. Also, too, the auditor should be able to prepare the IRS 990 based upon the audited financial statements that you as the board have approved, and it should be in all the same price of the either financial review or the audit. So oftentimes we hear words, oh, we've got a clean audit, and that's, you couldn't have a better audit, because what that means is that they didn't have to qualify anything. It's an unqualified audit. It provides the highest level of assurance that the financial statements that the coalition is providing are doing exactly what they're intended. So you'll see language such as what's in the slide here. The reader of an audit can be confident that any significant matters not shown on the face of the statements are adequately disclosed in the footnotes of the audit. The reader of the audit can be confident that appropriate accounting principles have been followed and that appropriate accounting processes have been used to consistently maintain appropriate statements from one period to the next. So if you see specific language unqualified, it's the best opinion you can have. Some boards may have familiarity with an organization or coalition receiving a management letter. And what I would say to a board on that is that a management letter is typically provided if an auditor wants to write about a particular system or process that could be improved. And by all means, a management letter is not required. And we, the coalition, New Hampshire Coalition, we haven't had a management letter in years. So here's some resources that I mentioned we would give to you. I think that I mentioned all the handouts. A great resource I mentioned earlier is the National Network to End Domestic Violence and the Resource Sharing Project. I want you to know again that it really could take months for your board to review some of these best practice models and to implement them. Keep plugging away at them, and you will definitely have, I think, very good financial management in your coalition. So I think we can open this up to question and answers now. Lindsay.
Thanks, Pam. Yeah, so we will be closing